Good afternoon, Elizabeth McNabb, W2W Link. Welcome. I'm so glad to have a fantastic speaker with us today, Jeffrey Tobias. And Jeffrey and I met around fabulous groups like Women's Food Service and Network of Executive Women. And he has been on the board. He's been a leader within the Coca-Cola Company for many years. During that time, he chose to go even bigger and deeper around diversity, around women's leadership, and grow by also doing research and being a book author. He's done a lot of excellence around sales execution, which we had a webinar and it's available on our site to go view, or today around women's leadership. And what I think is really compelling for us to listen to Jeffrey today is what we all know, some of our best mentors are men, some of our best advocates are men. But we know that we need to be very situational while we're learning and insights, and what better way to do it than someone that really is himself emotionally intelligent and is going to bring us with him. And so we want to go over just briefly the logistics and then kick in with Jeffrey. One, if you have questions that you want for Jeffrey, if something's going on with the webinar, you have a question, please use your panel over on the right and go ahead and put in your question and tap it in. And I'm welcoming Holly with me today from W2W Link, and the two of us are looking at that, responding, and also we'll be reading those questions out during the last 15 minutes of today's webinar. So put them in whenever you're thinking of them, and we'll share those. And then secondly, logistic-wise, we are taping the webinar. We will be sending you a thank you note with the webinar. Embedded in there is all the things that you're seeing if you want to read.
For 30 seconds about why I'm doing this work and really how I got engaged in this work. First and foremost, I'm a business person. I spent almost 15 years in line sales and sales management, and at my heart, I'm a sales guy and about growing more revenue. And about 15 years ago, I actually did a career transition and moved into sales training and diversity and leadership. And so for the last 15 years of my career, I've really worked on this convergence of, how do we drive more business results with diversity, and then more importantly, how do we drive operating profit? Because if you're going to engage with senior leaders, in a dialogue around diversity, and I've chosen to focus on women, what's the business case for that in terms of growing more business or saving more money? It can't just be an HR dialogue. It just can't be a nice-to-know strategy. And so about 10 years ago, I was actually invited in to do a special project with the Women's Forum of the Coca-Cola Company. I was a project manager, and I was invited in to help them write a 3-year strategic plan. And this was really my first immersion into any type of women's leadership activities. But I would go on to chair and first member of the Coca-Cola Women's Forum. I chaired strategic planning for 6 years. I would go on to run 2 major women's conferences for them. And it really began to engage me around the business case for women and women as consumers and women as employees, and how do we really grow leadership representation as a business imperative. And then a couple years ago, as I'm constantly sitting in a room with women thinking about how to grow their careers, how to make them more powerful, it dawned on me that women talking to women can only drive the agenda so far. So how are you going to go out and engage men who, quite frankly, are still in charge? But more importantly, how are you going to engage men who are ready to help you on this journey? And so I came up with this idea for this organization around engaging male champions and, quite frankly, educating women as well in really understanding and unleashing the power of women in organizations. And so with that, I've developed a talk that you're about to see, and it's this notion of executive success what men aren't telling women. And this is kind of a peek under the tent, right? This is things that people aren't going to tell you in corporate America. It's, you know, what are men thinking? But in this age of political correctness, they would never tell you. And so I want to start with the 3 things that you will never hear men say about women in business today. Number 1 is, I don't understand why things need to change. Quite frankly, I'm in charge and I'm pretty happy with the way things are. So I don't get this whole women's thing. Number 2, even if I knew why things needed to change, I don't know what needs to change or how to change it, right? You'll never get them to admit it, but trust me, this is something men are thinking. And then finally, after the why, the what, the how, it's who do you want to drive change? Because quite frankly, at the end of the day, men just don't care about this women's leadership initiative. Most men don't care, but some men do care, and some companies do care. And so how do we go about changing the dialogue? How do we begin to engage male champions to help women be successful and complete this journey to whatever level of the organization they want to go to? And so my objectives today are to really arm you with facts and figures and data so that you can go back and engage in a dialogue with your leadership team around the critical nature of women and answering these questions around why women today, what and how do we change things, and then finally, how do we find and engage male champions? And so this is a very fact-based research presentation you're about to see. The reason for that is men like facts. And so as you do your homework for this project or taking it back to your organization, I want you to think in terms of 3 things. 1 is understanding the business case for women today. Number 2, we're going to explore gender differences in leadership competencies. And then finally, we're going to create a roadmap for finding and engaging male champions. This leads us to our first polling question. And it's really around talent. And it talks about what is the percentage of new entries joining the workforce today that are women or minorities. So go ahead and vote on this, and please select one, 75%, 80%, or 85%. And we'll give you just a few seconds to go ahead and complete that. All right, we'll give you a few more seconds. All right, great. We're going to close the poll now. And so 42% of you said 85%, and that is the right answer. Believe it or not, 85% of new entries entering the workforce are women and minorities. And so as you look at this, and how you can go to the next slide, why is this so important? Well, what's happening in business today, and this goes back almost 3 years ago, soon to be 4, is on January 1st, 2008, the very first boomers became retiree eligible. And everybody knows that, but nobody has really contextualized what that means. What that says is as boomers retire, it is estimated that the labor pool of the U.S. will begin to decrease by 10,000 people per day, every day, for the next 15 years. So there's a huge talent drain that's going to be going on. And these boomers, who quite frankly are white male and make up about 60% of the prime workforce, in other words, middle and senior leadership, will be replaced by people who don't even look or think like them. This 85% of new entries who are women and minorities. And so the challenges of this are, even if boomers postpone retirement, which we know they are doing because the economy is very hard, there are still going to be 10 to 12 million more jobs than highly skilled people. And so there really is a war for talent going on. Well, what does the new talent look like? Well, let's focus on women for a minute. Women earn 58% of the bachelor's degrees and 60% of the master's degrees today. Said another way, here's a soundbite to take back to your company. White males today are only getting 30% of the master's degrees in this country. And so even if I, as a white male leader, want to put on my racist, sexist hat and say we're only going to promote white males, this is not a sustainable business strategy because, quite frankly, the talent pipeline that I have to choose from doesn't look the way the current talent pool looks. And then the challenge for organizations today is this pipeline of ready now talent does not resemble the new marketplace. And a lot of that leads to, and draws from the fact that, quite frankly, leaders have never been trained to assess and develop and retain talent that doesn't think, look, and act the way they do. And so this notion of this business case for talent is very, very real, and it's only going to escalate in the next 5 to 10 years. Now let's talk about women as consumers, and here's our second polling question. Women in the U.S. buy or influence what percentage of all purchases? 74%, 79%, or 83%?
Great. We'll give you a few more seconds. All right, great. We're going to close the poll now.
And you're right. 82% of you said 83%. And this is absolutely right. Women basically drive the entire economy of the United States. They spend 83% of all dollars in this country. And they spend them on a host of different items. And it doesn't really matter whether they buy or influence. They are really the drivers of the entire economy of the United States. You know, if you think about things like financial services or vacations or home furnishings or houses or even do-it-yourself projects, you know, think Home Depot and Lowe's at 80%, the numbers are overwhelming. And so how has your company articulated its business case for women as consumers? That's the driver of revenue. That's the business case. That's how we make more money. And on the next slide, you'll see 83% is, in fact, the right number, and it's actually increasing about a point a year, and is planned to do so for the next foreseeable future. So we've talked about business as a revenue driver. We've talked about the war for talent. Now we want to talk about one more thing, and that is engagement. And engagement, for those of you who maybe don't do engagement surveys, engagement is a function of how productive your employees are. Organizations will do climate surveys or engagement surveys. It's typically 120 questions, and that's everything from safety and resources, etc. But the whole goal of this is to reach 80%. Said another way, in an 8-hour day, and nobody works an 8-hour day anymore, but in an 8-hour day, how do I get 6.4 good hours of work out of you? Well, sadly, most companies are in the 40 to 50% range. What does that look like? That says I'm paying you for 8 hours of work, and you're only giving me 4 hours of work. What does disengagement look like? Well, you know, it looks like, you know, I don't have the tools needed to do my job, or, you know, I have to multitask, or I have to pick children up, or I have to take care of elderly parents. And so this notion of flex time, you know, is no longer a nice thing to do. It is, at the end of the day, all about how do I get more work out of you. And what's fascinating is now research shows that women in high-performing companies are typically more engaged than men. And so women are actually your best employee. Women equal higher engagement, which equals more productivity, which equals operating effectiveness, which drops immediately to your bottom line. So greater operating profit. So as we step back and summarize these key points, you know, revenue growth, women buy over 80% of all products. The war for talent, over 80% of new entries are women or minorities. And then finally, in high-performing companies, engagement goals are 80%. And companies that have strong women's programs, typically women are the most highly engaged workers. So the business case has never been more solid. So that answers this whole question of why is this important and how do you engage the senior leaders in this dialogue. Now let's step back and answer this question of what and how needs to change. And so we're going to frame this in very much of a business context around leadership competencies or leadership behaviors and how gender plays itself out in these areas. This brings us to our next polling question. It's actually a series of 3 questions that we want you to answer. So, men or women, who is better at networking? Answer this question. Who is better at networking, men or women?
All right, we'll give you a few more seconds for this one. All right, 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll.
52% men, 48% women. Okay, let's go to our next polling question. Who is better at problem solving, men or women?
All right, we'll give you about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close this poll.
78% of women, or 78% said women, and 22% said men. I'd love to know the representation of our people on the webinar to see if it's highly female skewed. Given the topic, I'm thinking that it is. Okay, and then let's go to our last one. And that's who's better at influencing upward in the organization.
All right, we'll give about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll.
And you say 82% of men and 18% of women. Great. So let's take these results and then look at how this relates to some great research that was done about 18 months to 2 years ago by Catalyst. And this is kind of an eye chart, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it so that you understand it. But Catalyst asked 300 leaders. They didn't ask the question I asked of who's better. They said merely rate men and women at these 10 leadership competencies. And then what they did is they went back and cross-analyzed them, and they looked at men's replies and they looked at women's replies. And so the competencies are down the left-hand column, and you could do this exercise with your organization and plug them in. But the competencies that Catalyst looked at were team building, mentoring, consulting, networking, supporting, rewarding, problem solving, inspiring, delegating, and influencing upward. And the way you read this chart across is basically men said men and women are about equal in team building, mentoring, and consulting. Women actually said they were better at team building, mentoring, and consulting. And remember, this is a representation of 50-50 men and women. Networking was an interesting one, where men said, oh, we think it's roughly equal, but women actually replied, no, we think men are better at this. And so I've graded that out to say, this may be a potential area, a development area for women. And so that's one of the competencies we're going to talk about. You look at supporting and rewarding, no great surprise. Men said women were better at this, as did women. If you read the research, some women actually view this as kind of condescending to say, yes, of course men would say we're better at supporting people, and maybe men need to get better at this. And then problem solving is an interesting one, because men said they were better at it, and women said they were better at it. And so if you go back to our poll results, where 78% of women, and I'm guessing that's largely the representation of the people on the call, said they're better. And so we're going to explore this area as well, as I think this may be an area of possible bias for men in understanding how women solve problems. And so that's one of the other areas we're going to talk about. Inspiring, men said they did it better, women said they did it better. We're not going to talk about that today. Delegating, men said they did it better, and quite frankly, women said they thought men did it better. So that could be a development area for women. But then this last one, when you think about within one or two levels of the C-suite, influencing upward is such a critical skill. And men said they thought they did it better, and women acknowledged that men do it better as well. And so that is potentially a development area for women. And so we're going to choose to focus to take a deep dive today on these three competencies called networking, problem solving, and influencing upward. So go ahead and advance the slide, please, Holly. So if we look at networking, and this is one where 52% said men did it better and 48% said women did it better, and that was of our online poll via the webinar. And that's very similar and close to what the men said, that they thought they were about comparable, but in the Catalyst research, women actually said men were better, which matches our results. And it gets to reading the Catalyst definition, which is this notion of developing and maintaining relationships with others who may provide information or support resources. And so that becomes a key crux of this. Women have networks that are significantly broader than men. Women are connected. Women's networks, based on the research you see, could be 3 to 4 times larger than men's networks. But the issue is they don't mindfully use their network to help them in business. And so do you mindfully know how to use your network? And this is one of the things that you will never hear men say. And what I like to do is tell a story with a bit of a business context, but it's also a personal story that I hope a lot of folks can relate to. And that is when, the new neighbors move in, and you walk down the cul-de-sac, and my wife Phyllis and I walk down, and we meet Dave and Marcia, and I shake hands with Dave, and Phyllis shakes hands with Marcia, and, we talk for 15 minutes, and then, I'll talk to Marcia briefly, and Phyllis will talk to Dave briefly, and we'll turn around and walk back home. And I'll immediately, because I work in women's leadership, I'll turn to my wife Phyllis and say, Phyllis, what does Marcia do for a living? And she'll say, I don't know, we didn't talk about that. And I'll look at her kind of incredulous and go, what do you mean you didn't talk about that? And she said, why, what did you guys talk about? And I said, I shake his hand and say, hi, Jeff Halter, I'm president of my own consulting company. And, Dave says, hi, I'm a VP of marketing for IBM. And we immediately start thinking about how we can help each other. Those are the first words out of our mouth. And her conversation has to do with, the neighborhood and finding daycare and, getting the kids to school and things like that. And it's a very different dialogue. And I believe that plays itself out at work as well. And that is this notion of men connect with one of the purposes, mindfully or subconsciously, being how can you help me and how can I help you? And this is something that women struggle with, that they would certainly not want to betray the trust of their network. Well, it's something that men do. And so that's where I would encourage you to think about how do you mindfully use your network to provide information, garner support before the big meeting, before the big customer presentation. How are you mindfully using your network? And quite frankly, how are you using social media, things like Women-to-Women Link, to expand and utilize your network for business results? Because as an area of significant strength, Tom Peters has actually done some research, and it said women build relationships significantly better than men. There's a male stockbroker in New York who used to deal with men and women, and for every successful engagement, he got 2.3 referrals from every male client he gave good service to, but from every female client he got 26 different referrals. And now this gentleman works exclusively with women clients. He's also built his portfolio significantly, but this is a good tangible example of how mindfully are you utilizing women's networks to, quite frankly, support yourself and support each other. And so the key takeaway on networking from a development standpoint is I think there's a real mindfulness opportunity to network for women with a purpose. Let's talk about problem solving now. And no great surprise, the catalyst definition, identifying, analyzing, and acting decisively to remove impediments to work performance. Pretty common definition. And this was the one, if you think back on the results, where catalyst said, men said they do it better, and women said they do it better. And our poll results, 78% of you said women are better problem solvers. And so the question becomes, who makes better decisions? Well, what research is increasingly showing is men tend to be much more left brain and women tend to be much more whole brain. What that means is, men are thinking about facts and data, whereas women are taking in and processing significantly more amounts of data than men are. Research is now showing that typically women do make better decisions and solve problems better. However, they take longer, and it's because they're taking in and processing more data to come up with that better solution. Men are much more apt to come up with a quicker answer and defend it to the death. And I'm sure if you're in business, you've all seen this play itself out. And so it speaks to this notion of problem solving versus decisiveness. And if you're in a senior leader role and you're a female, the kiss of death for you is looking indecisive. And so if your male colleague is out there with an 80% solution and he's willing to fight to it to the death, and you're coming up with a 110% solution, well, you're being seen as indecisive by the other men, and quite frankly, it is still men at the table. And so it's this notion of how can you help your male colleagues, because quite frankly, this is their issue, not yours, to be much more explicit in your problem solving. And what does that look like? Specifically, that looks like, Jim, if you need an answer today, then I say we go with option A. But you have to know I am still vetting this with legal and finance and supply chain. But make no mistake, if you need an answer today, I say we go with option A. And so, sadly, the burden of this, until we can train men how to appreciate and embrace the problem-solving skills of women, women can help themselves by just being much more articulate in helping us understand your decision-making process and taking us through your journey that you're going through. But don't ever confuse decisiveness with problem-solving. Because that's a big one, I think, that typically hurts women, particularly when they're the only woman in the room, is you just don't want to be labeled as indecisive. So let's take a look at our next one, which is influencing upward. And this was interesting because both men and women said men do this better. And whether you want to call this politics or you want to call it managing upward or whatever you want to call it, I think this is a real development opportunity. I spent the last 10 years working in leadership development. And what I've come up with is I think it's a combination of two things. I think one is it's a skill, but then the second part is it's really an art. And so let's explore that for a minute. I think the foundation really is a number of elements. And this first one is really shocking, and it goes back to this whole notion of executive success, what men aren't telling women. And this is really hard for most women, but I want you to try it just for a day. I want you to master the art of delegating and, quite frankly, doing nothing. What does that look like? That's going to free you and empower your team and drive decisions down so that you can actually step back and think about the business on a more strategic level and spend your time thinking about how you are managing upward. How are you controlling senior leadership? Because as an SVP or even a VP level, at least 50% of your job is managing upward to get resources, to talk about budgets, to talk about sales numbers, or anything else that's going on. So one of the big things of influencing upward is to find time to do it, and the best way to do that is to become a master of delegation. And this is really hard for women as they move up in their careers, because 9 times out of 10, you've gotten promoted because you are the absolute best at what you do, which says you tend to be a perfectionist, you tend to take on a lot of things, which is phenomenal. But when you move from that director to the VP level, you have to be willing to give up. And you have to be willing to do some sacrifices to build your team. So mastering the art of delegating is actually one of those skills needed for you to have the time to influence upward. The next one is around negotiating. And there was some research done recently around this topic of negotiating. And they asked men and women what they thought about as an analogy to negotiating. And the one analogy men came up with is, ooh, it's about winning a ball game. Men love to negotiate. Men love the banter. When women were asked in the research, give us an analogy of what negotiating sounds like, they came up with going to the dentist. And it's this whole notion of, do you like to engage in negotiating? Because if you're going to move up and be successful, you have to become a master salesperson and a master negotiator. And a lot of that is taking your own fear away, realizing that the male colleague you may be negotiating with or competing against looks at this as a fun activity. They don't look at this as a going to the dentist. They look at this as, hey, we're going to have some fun with this. So again, it's kind of changing this mindset. And then our next one really focuses on risk-taking. And we talk about this in the big meeting, and I know you have all been there. And it's the male colleague, and it's this male tendency to, fight to the death. It's this whole decisiveness thing. Men are much more willing to put an 80% solution out there and fight it to the death, whereas the tendency of women is to believe that they have to come in with 100%, 110% of the solution and then defend it. And so risk-taking becomes a huge part of managing upward and influencing upward. And so how much risk are you willing to take in this notion of influencing upward? And then our next one really speaks about this mindfulness around where do you focus your time. And it's not just about results. And our next slide speaks to this. And there's some great research that's been done by Jan Hill and Vanessa Weaver called Smart Women, Smart Move. And they look at what they call a pie model. And we want you to internalize this. Performance in business today is a given, right? You are not going to get promoted without exceptional results. But that is a bare minimum. For you to move up in the organization, you've got to be very good at what you do. But then where a lot of women fall short is in the I and the E, and so we'll talk about those. The I is your image, your reputation. And the best way to think about this is if you were to ask a colleague, what are 3 words that leadership would use to describe me? Are those positives or are those negatives? Are you the go-to girl? Are you the strategic thinker? Are you the closer? What are 3 adjectives that describe you and your image? And you'll hear a lot of talk about having your elevator speech. Well, if you were to describe yourself in 3 words, what are they? And then more importantly, how do you let senior leadership know that? Because that leads to the next one, which is exposure. Do people actually know who you are in organizations? Performance is a given, and if I'm a senior leader looking at my organization, and I've got 30 people, well, you know what, performance is a given, So I find 10% of these, I find 10 of these people that I deem are highly promotable. Well, what do I really know about them? What's their image? And then secondly, do they know who I am? And what is my exposure factor? Does senior leadership, in fact, know who I am? Do leaders 2 or 3 levels above where you're working today know who you are? And so this looks like 3 things. One is this notion of mentors, advocates, and sponsors. And there's a great Harvard Business Review article that came out in December of 2010 that talked about the difference between these 3. There's a lot of talk that's been done around gathering mentors. And everyone always thought that that was kind of the holy grail. Well, new research is showing that you need multiple mentors. And mentors are nothing more than subject matter experts who can help you with a specific area of the business for you to get expertise. Advocates are people who will go to bat for you. They will raise your name up in a meeting. They will say, I think we need to think about Sarah for this promotion, or I think we need to think about Becky for this rotational assignment. But then the big one is sponsors. And Harvard describes sponsors as someone who is willing to put their career on the line for you. And so if you think about that, that's a much higher relationship than either a mentor or an advocate. Harvard would tell you that sponsors are organically grown. I would tell you it comes through significant exposure and getting to know the business, and then beginning to make connections and really finding people who are willing to support and sponsor you in the organization. And that, quite frankly, comes from visibility to executive leaders and visibility to other roles and other networks. So as we kind of wrap up this last competency, it's bringing it all together, right? It's getting coaching. It's getting honest feedback around your strengths and your areas of development. It's learning to delegate. It's building your team on the way up. It's mentoring. And then it's really leveraging focused networking. And so as you kind of summarize this last really big competency, that's a tough one. But I think it's a huge area of opportunity that if women can work harder, and quite frankly, we can get men to embrace this concept, organizations at the end of the day are going to be more successful. So now let's answer this last question around who's going to drive change, and this notion of, do men really care about supporting women's leadership initiatives? And again, the great research that's out there comes from Catalyst. They recently did a survey of a number of member companies to talk about, how do you begin to engage male champions? And the article started out by saying, well, before you can begin to engage male champions, you need to understand the norms for being a man. And in order to do that, you've really got to immerse yourself into male culture, because it is a major stumbling block of why more men will not become sponsors for women. And Catalyst came up with 3 things that were really kind of the big ahas. The first one is, and this goes back literally to grade school, it's this notion of men should avoid all things feminine. Be a man's man. Stop your crying, stop your whining. Those are seen as soft things, as feminine things. And this is literally generations of culture that have been brought up to, quite frankly, ignore or play down things that are feminine. The next one then is be a winner. And there's a lot of talk around this that men are just better at promoting themselves. There's no issue with men using the word, I did this or I did that. Whereas women tend to use more of a collective, well, we did this and the team did that. And so winning in male culture is very much about me or I, even though we may not say that. And then finally, the last one that Catalyst said is show no chinks in the armor. This notion that family stuff is for wimps. I think this one is actually going away from a generational standpoint. I think you've got more and more men coming up in the organization who are willing to leave work to see their daughter's soccer game as women are to see their son's softball game. I think that one's going to go away over time, but you've still got a significant percentage of senior leaderships that, you know what, it's about business every day, and yeah, you know, it's great to have a family and everything else, but you know what, we're about business around here. So part of this is understanding the rules for being a man. But then Catalyst said, okay, if that's the case, how do we then go about finding champions, and in fact, what do they look like? And what they came up with were really three things. One is, in any organization, there are 15 to 20% of men who just have a strong sense of fairness. They have a very non-biased view of talent. And as I've talked to senior women in organizations, it's fascinating that routinely one or two men will have reached down at some point very early in their career and said, Katie, I like you. I'm going to help you. And it had nothing to do with Katie being a woman. They just saw Katie as a very talented person. And they said, I'm going to go out of my way to help you. And so there are just people who have a very non-biased view of talent. And oh, by the way, you all know who those people are in your organization. They're the managers everybody wants to work for. There are also men in the organization who have a really deep understanding of the business case around education and dialogue. And if you think about the business case and where we started, you know, if you're in a B2C, business to consumer business, you absolutely fundamentally have to understand that 80+% of your revenue is coming from women. And so if you're a good businessman, even if you don't get the cultural competency or the gender competency, you need to understand this. And so that's a great growth opportunity for men. And then the last one is a personal connection. And that looks like one of two things. That would be a male leader who either has a mother or a spouse or a sister who is in business and has experienced some hardship. But then the biggest personal connection and real opportunity is fathers of daughters. And so my one piece of homework assignment for you all is to go back and look your male leaders in the eye. And feel free to use this webinar today as a catalyst to go back and ask the question, hey, Jim, do you think this is a good place for women to work? And Jim, would you want your daughter working for this company or some of the managers that you know here? Or Jim, are you happy that your daughter's going to graduate from a great school and only make 80 cents on the dollar compared to your son? Is that what you've chosen to do? And just this personal connection a lot of times is all men need to begin to think differently. And then ask them to ask their daughters, go home and tell your daughter how you're supporting women in the workplace. That it's not just a one or the other, it's really a collectiveness. And so don't underestimate this real powerful personal connection between fathers and daughters. It is significant and it cannot be overlooked. So as we wrap up today, just in quick summary, you know, go back and talk about the business case for women. Business leaders want facts and data. Well, the data is overwhelming. Women are decision makers, women are the talent pool, and women are the drivers of engagement. Go back and talk in terms of business leadership competencies. Again, this is not a nice to do. This is around how can we engage the organization. For women, from a development opportunity, how can you more mindfully network? How can you be explicit and decisive in your problem solving? How can you have a plan for managing up? And at this point of the presentation, this very much sounds like I'm charging women with going out and driving all the change. And I'll tell you that is not fair, but these are the rules that have been written by men. And you can either choose to engage or not. The higher you go in the organization, the more you're going to be able to affect change. And I would be the last person in the world to advocate that you should have to do anything that I've recommended, quite frankly, to get ahead in the organization. However, these are the rules. This is the way the game is played. And if you choose to do that, then these may be development opportunities for you to go out and just be more successful. And then finally, we talked about how do you find and engage male champions and what are the criteria for them. And so go out and use this webinar as a way to go out and talk to your senior leaders in your organization. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to turn this back to Holly and Elizabeth because they've been gathering questions throughout the presentation, and I think we're going to review some of those. So I'll kick it back to you guys.
You bet. Go ahead and write questions in now. We've got some that have come in, and then we're going to take a couple minutes as transition. I'm going to show you a couple areas of W2W Link site. That is, we do events in 8 cities and get asked questions through emails from our members. They ask, how do you do this? So looking at the W2W Link site, I just want to let you know that I'm going to take us into network circles where you often are filling in your profile and choosing to be in groups and how to do that. Look at the professional tracks and then how to update your account to join additional network circles or let us know anything new about you and your profile status. And in network circles, I'm going to go to Ask Executive Coach. We've got expert circles you can join. Marty Lichten has one on networking and different ones. But in addition, we have several experts, and Jeffrey, we should get you here in the right quarter as you look out ahead, to start a thread for 2 to 3 months where they post in something weekly and answer questions for folks. And we did the innovation and execution with Karen Williams and myself in the last couple months in the webinar. So we've got conversations in there. So just as a sample, if you join the network circle, you're able to read the discussion from others, and you're able to come in and ask a question of peers in some of the circles or of the coach. You type that in. You can attach articles, PDFs, answers for others, and post that in. And when that happens, or somebody's posted in, you'll see in your iPhone or in your BlackBerry or on your PC an email, and you can get those each time. Emails that happens here each time they are posted. You could choose to just get once a day from the circle to different discussion threads. And you get about a paragraph. So it's a nice way so people are talking in there and to come in behind them. Secondly, professional tracks are an area that we have leadership, really sort of like one-day seminars, but in a digital form so you can do it self-paced when you want. And when I think of Jeffrey's topic today, I think it's complementary with Denise Brulé, who talked about mastering power politics at work. I think Jeffrey's given us great ideas around gender and sophisticated. So here's another track that's complementary to that has a series of articles. You take self-assessment at the beginning. You can ask questions during it. There's many videos and 10-minute webinars embedded all in this track. And by the end, you set up your action steps. And what we know is when we tell a coach or tell others about our actions, we get it done. So all of it's been built to help you move things along. And then lastly, just wanted to point out that anytime you sign in, you can tap into my account, and we're in mine, and so you can update your profile status. It's important if you joined us year 1 a couple of years ago, you didn't ever get your city and your zip code because we didn't do events in cities then, and we do now. So it's important to let us know your city. And I hear that still from people that have been with us a while, that they aren't seeing our events, that they don't know we'll do things with partners in their city, and that's the way that they'll know about that. So with that, I'm going to have Holly and I start answering, asking questions of Jeffrey. Holly, do you want to read one out?
Sure. We have a question from Cynthia, and she asks, my company has changed executive leadership in the last year. The culture is trending towards the boys club. Any suggestions for how to work in that environment?
Wow, that's a tough one. I would go back to, I don't know what kind of industry you're in, Cynthia, but, I think it's constantly going back to this business case, because that's what business leaders, regardless if they're men or women, want to hear. And it's this whole notion of, how are we growing revenue, or how are we increasing operating effectiveness, regardless if it's women, minorities, gay, lesbian employees, etc. And it's a hard one, because quite frankly, if you're in a B2C type environment, it's an absolute no-brainer. And so how do you bring forth facts and data? How do you grow your business, etc.? If you're in B2B, it's a little bit tougher, unless you've got a growing base of companies that are, women-owned businesses. Women-owned businesses are growing, at just an exponential rate in this country. But the business case in B2B really boils down to a really tight talent discussion. And the point is, who owns talent in organizations? Because, business has really changed nowadays. Talent really needs to be owned by the entire leadership team. And it goes back to these notions of asking, if you're at a senior enough level, are we going to be in business in 10 years? And, 9 times out of 10, I would hope senior leaders would say, yes, we're going to be in business in 10 years. Well, what does our succession planning look like, 2 to 3 to 5 to 10 years out? Because, oh, by the way, men are only getting 30% of the master's degrees, and if we're in a highly trained field, whether that's financial services or petrochemical or whatnot, there is a very, very real shortage of talent coming up. And don't confuse the massive unemployment rate that we have in this country with the talent shortage, because the really bright, talented people, the people who have the right skill set, you know what, they're going to get hired away, they're going to get poached away. And so what are your retention strategies? And so all I would encourage you to do is continue to go back and build your business case and talk to senior leaders about the future, about 2 to 5 years, around what does that look like and where are we going. And I think that'll be, partially successful. And then, hopefully some of the tips and techniques that I shared with you can maybe help you manage that on a more daily basis.
Definitely. And Jeffrey, I'm going to come in behind on that one. In this question and several, I want to underline that we know a lot of you guys are in entrepreneur settings, and Jeffrey is fantastic with his ideas, both in a corporate setting, a small cap setting, and an entrepreneur setting. As I moved after 20 years of corporate into entrepreneur and posed some different thoughts with Jeffrey, he gave me great ideas. So, know that, when we talk about a boys club setting that could be in a corporate environment, that can often happen in a small cap environment. In both settings, Jeffrey talked through the call about different resources. It's a good time to go get ideas from Jeffrey today and go, join a business association or an industry association. Almost all now have a women's group or things that you can do if you're in a smaller city, ways to kind of come across, and through Jeffrey Link as well, as he said. So
and Elizabeth, let me build on that for just a second, because one of the most valuable things that I stumbled on in my career, and this was certainly not mindful, but when I told you that I became the chair of strategic planning for the Women's Forum, literally within a year, I met every senior woman at the Coca-Cola company, and they knew who I was. And so I'm a huge, huge advocate of joining networking associations or business associations. And quite frankly, if you're a small business owner who's female, go join the boys club and figure out what's going on with them in your industry. Because networking with men is going to be exponentially, potentially richer, because they're going to get to know who you are. As opposed to just, and oh, by the way, go to the women's organizations. Join every organization you can. I'm a huge believer in it. But, it's not just joining the women's organizations. It's really building your social capital outside the area you're really, really comfortable with.
That's a good point. And for the small business owners, to your point, too, the capital is in the hands, very biased towards men. And
oh, my gosh, yes.
Take the point Jeffrey said on taking risks. To your point of joining the business, club, getting the vote, it is really important to do both.
All right, we also have a question from Tasha, and she asks, what is the best way to connect with a senior manager 2 levels above your position when you haven't had personal interaction with the manager, but you have attended meetings with the manager?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and boy, oh boy, this really takes a lot of courage. Send them an invitation. Send them an invitation and meet them for 10 minutes. I have not found literally any senior leader who, if you write graciously and honestly, Mr. Taylor, I've worked in your organization for the last couple of years. and I really admire your career, and I would love to just get 15 minutes on your calendar to maybe talk about your thoughts on the industry, career strategies, potentially mistakes you've made. I have found this to just be, if you have the courage to do it, it is absolutely invaluable. And, oh, by the way, tell your immediate manager that you're going to do it so that they're not blindsided. But if it's done with genuine intent and not political intent, I have literally never found a senior leader who isn't willing to take 15 minutes with somebody in their organization and sit down and talk to them. And 9 times out of 10, it turns into a mentor relationship, a sponsor relationship. And if you don't feel comfortable sending an email, the next time you're at that company meeting or that social gathering, go up and ask them a question. Find out something personal. Number one, and I know this is something that women do as well as men, but first of all, get to know his secretary or his administrative assistant, project manager, and find out a couple personal things about him. Does his daughter go to Georgia Tech? And, does his son do this or whatnot? And kind of find that personal connection. And just, offer to buy him coffee because you'd love to spend 15 minutes with them and find out, wow, how did you become so successful in this organization? And I haven't found too many people who have turned you down for that.
Great. Well, we have another question from a member of our community, and they ask, how would we adjust to a left brain boss to ensure they see our strengths and problem solving? As an example, I am leading a project and my boss wants an update, and I see there are 2 options working, and polarizing in the readout by consumers. Are there suggestions on how to handle that I am analytical and a strong problem solver, and yet the next step is to include several advisors or others to get to the final answer?
Yeah, here's a great way to go about that, and a couple words of advice. And I actually talk about this a lot in my sales book. When you're dealing with left-brain people, you need to cut your communication by 2/3. You need to be very fact-based, you need to be very tight, and you need to be very crisp. So particularly if you're a woman dealing with a man, because and there's a lot of research on this, women communicate 3 times the number of words, the number of nonverbals. And so how do you be very short, precise, crisp? Have you practiced? But then a couple other things I would really encourage people that maybe they don't see on the way up. And it's the whole notion of the meeting before the meeting. And that is, how many people have you gone around and pre-sold on your idea? So that when you walk into your boss's office, you've already talked to supply chain and finance and the operations group, and that you already have either alignment, or if they disagree with your initiative, you at least know why they disagree. And that allows you to come in, and again, if it's problem solving, I really encourage, a very short 1 to 2 to 3 page presentation with a big appendix to say, here's all the data. And if you want to know what supply chain thinks about this, I've talked to so-and-so, and their data's in there. But, I don't know if you're a PowerPoint or a Word type culture. If you're a Word culture, do the Procter & Gamble 1-page memo. If you're a PowerPoint culture, do no more than a 3 or 4 page PowerPoint presentation. But then use a lot of appendices that demonstrate your expertise without you having to say it.
Great, really great ideas. I'm going to come in behind you now, Jeffrey, and just point out, I've been on ywomen.biz, ywomen.biz, which is Jeffrey's website, is moving from Coca-Cola into the world of entrepreneur land and growing business and speaking. You can get his book there for yourself, or give it to a mentee or a woman client, for others around you to learn. And fabulous content on there as well. We will have this webinar link sent to you over the next week, as we mentioned. And next month, on September 12th, I invite you to join us with Dr. Relly Nadler. On the 12th, we're going to go to a little bit different time of day, 3 to 4 Central, 4 to 5 Eastern. And that's Leading with Emotional Intelligence, Tools for Top Performance. He's an author. You've seen his book out there at Barnes & Noble and such on emotional intelligence. So it's a great thought leader like Jeffrey today. And then October 11th, we'll be with Marcia Clark, and she's going to be helping us really leverage our situational selves. When we think about advice from Jeffrey and from others and men champions, I mean, often over the years, we sometimes start synthesizing and feeling like we're starting to morph out of our comfort zone. We want to be successful, as Jeffrey tells us, do be situational, but sometimes it can feel like you are pushed yourself a little far. What Marcia's really done successfully with 10+ years of leadership labs is helping women to end up actualizing completely to the changes they make, to know that they own it and they're doing it for their desires, their results, and not for others. And I think that you can really take things we learned from Jeffrey today in that session and really power up this year and going into next. And there was a great USA Today article yesterday on how women are going to take us out of this economy. And Jeffrey, I would thank you for your inspiration today. We can hear that you believe that women are going to continue to grow businesses and be great for business. And we've got a ping out in our LinkedIn group and over on Facebook about the USA Today article. So feel free to join us there. And Jeffrey, I know that you're tweeting and have Facebook going as well. So we'll look to learn from you in your groups and such. So thank you very much. Thank you, Holly, for leading us through this fantastic day. All right. Great one. Bye.
Bye-bye.